They don't fear your anger. They don't fear your tears. They fear the moment you stop needing them, because the instant you become emotionally untouchable is the instant the narcissist feels something close to panic. And that's when respect shows up. If this resonates, pause for a moment and ask yourself, where in my life do I still over-explain? Where do I still try to prove my worth? Drop a done in the comments if you're ready to stop negotiating your boundaries. Narcissists fear loss of control more than confrontation, and this is the piece most people misunderstand. You might think they are afraid of being yelled at, exposed, or criticized. They are not. In fact, confrontation often energizes them. It gives them material to twist, deny, minimize, and weaponize. It keeps the interaction alive. What truly unsettles them is not intensity. It is the moment they realize they can no longer steer the emotional direction of the relationship. Control for a narcissistic personality is regulation. It is how they manage their fragile self-esteem. If they can provoke you into defending yourself, they feel powerful. If they can withdraw and make you chase, they feel significant. If they can confuse you with mixed signals, they feel superior. Every reaction from you becomes proof that they still have influence. Confrontation still contains engagement. Engagement still contains access. Loss of control, however, is different. It happens when your responses become measured, minimal, and predictable. It happens when you stop arguing point by point and instead say, "That doesn't work for me," and disengage. It happens when guilt no longer pulls you back into negotiation. In those moments, they experience something far more destabilizing than anger: uncertainty. Uncertainty is intolerable to someone who depends on manipulating outcomes. If they cannot predict whether you will react, chase, appease, or explode, they cannot script their next move. Their usual tactics: intimidation, charm, gaslighting, silent treatment, lose precision. And when tactics lose precision, their sense of dominance weakens. This is why emotional neutrality is so powerful. Not cruelty, not revenge, composure. When you regulate yourself instead of reacting impulsively, you interrupt the feedback loop they rely on. You stop feeding the dynamic that kept them in charge. They may escalate briefly to test whether control is truly gone. But if your boundaries remain steady and your consequences consistent, the power shifts. Because what they fear most is not conflict, it is becoming ineffective in influencing you. Emotional detachment destabilizes their power dynamic because it removes the very fuel that keeps the system running. A narcissistic personality does not connect in the traditional sense. They attach through impact. Your admiration, your frustration, your confusion, even your hurt, all of it confirms that they can reach you. Emotional intensity, whether positive or negative, reassures them that they still occupy space in your inner world. Detachment changes that equation completely. When you emotionally detach, you are not being cold or cruel. You are withdrawing investment. You stop personalizing every jab. You stop scrambling to fix every misunderstanding. You stop trying to decode every mixed signal. Instead of reacting from wounded emotion, you respond from grounded clarity, or sometimes you choose not to respond at all. This is deeply destabilizing for someone who relies on emotional leverage. If they insult you and you calmly say, "I'm not engaging with that," the usual script collapses. If they withdraw to provoke anxiety and you use that time to focus on your own life, their silent treatment loses its function. If they exaggerate a conflict and you refuse to defend yourself in circles, the drama cannot escalate. Detachment also disrupts the hierarchy they depend on. In their internal world, they must feel superior, central, influential. When you detach, You subtly communicate that your emotional stability does not hinge on their approval or presence. That signals equality, or worse, independence. Independence feels like threat because it means they are no longer the regulator of your mood. What makes detachment so powerful is its consistency. One detached response can be dismissed, a pattern cannot. Over time, they recognize that emotional theatrics no longer yield predictable results, and when they cannot extract reassurance through reaction, they are forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. They are not as powerful in your life as they believed. That recognition shakes the dynamic at its core. Boundaries create psychological consequences they cannot manipulate, and that is precisely why they are so powerful. A narcissistic personality is skilled at bending conversations, reframing history, and shifting blame. They rely on emotional loopholes. If you explain too much, they will argue. If you defend yourself, they will dissect your words. If you soften your stance, they will push further. What they look for are openings, places where your uncertainty allows them to renegotiate reality. A boundary, when done correctly, removes the opening. A true boundary is not a lecture. It is not a threat. It is not an attempt to control their behavior. It is a clear statement of what you will do if a line is crossed. If you raise your voice, I will end the conversation. If you insult me, I will leave. If this continues, I will limit contact. The power is not in convincing them to agree. The power is in your follow-through. This is where psychological consequence enters. Narcissistic dynamics survive because there are usually no consistent outcomes. They may mistreat you, but the relationship continues as normal. They may violate limits, but you eventually re-engage. Over time, they learn that boundaries are flexible suggestions. When you shift from emotional reaction to behavioral consequence, the system changes. What makes this difficult for them is that consequences tied to your behavior are harder to manipulate. They can argue about facts. They can gaslight perceptions. But they cannot argue with you calmly hanging up the phone. They cannot debate with you physically leaving the room. They cannot rewrite a boundary that is enforced through action rather than words. At first, they may escalate. They may accuse you of being dramatic, cold, or unfair. This is an attempt to regain negotiation space. But if your response remains consistent, not louder, not angrier, just steady, the unpredictability they once exploited disappears. Over time, they begin to understand that access to you is conditional on respectful behavior. Not because you force them to change, but because the alternative reliably results in distance, and distance is a consequence they feel. Indifference removes the supply they depend on, and that is where the real shift happens. A narcissistic personality feeds on emotional reactions the way a fire feeds on oxygen. Praise fuels their grandiosity. Anger fuels their sense of impact. Tears confirm their power. Even your attempts to reason with them can become supply because it shows you are still invested in the outcome. What matters most is not whether the emotion is positive or negative. It is that it exists and that it revolves around them. Indifference is different. Indifference says, you no longer occupy the center of my emotional world. And that message lands harder than any confrontation ever could. When you respond with neutrality instead of outrage, when you decline to defend yourself against distortions, when you no longer rush to fix their mood swings, you remove reinforcement. The dramatic story falls flat. The provocative comment hangs in the air unanswered. The attempt to trigger jealousy or insecurity meets a steady, unbothered presence. This is deeply unsettling because it interrupts the validation loop they rely on. Without reaction, they cannot measure their influence. Without visible impact, they cannot reassure themselves of importance. Indifference creates ambiguity, and ambiguity feels like loss. At first, they may intensify efforts to provoke you. They might escalate criticism, manufacture crises, or suddenly become charming again. These are attempts to reestablish emotional access. If indifference cracks into defensiveness or longing, the supply line reopens. But if your neutrality remains consistent, calm tone, brief responses, limited engagement, the strategy weakens. Indifference is not cruelty, it is emotional conservation. It is deciding that your energy will no longer be allocated to managing someone else's instability. Over time, they begin to sense that their usual tactics no longer generate predictable emotional returns. And when a narcissist realizes they cannot reliably extract admiration, fear, or chaos from you, something shifts internally. Because without supply, the illusion of control becomes harder to sustain. Calm assertiveness triggers respect where pleading never will, because it communicates strength without inviting combat. Pleading operates from a position of emotional exposure. It says, "Please understand me. Please treat me better. Please see my value." And while that vulnerability is human, a narcissistic personality often interprets it as leverage. The more you plead, the clearer it becomes that your emotional state is still influenced by their approval or rejection. Calm assertiveness sends a different signal. It sounds like, "That doesn't work for me. I'm not comfortable with that. If this continues, I'll remove myself." There is no raised voice, no trembling explanation, no long defense, just clarity. This is disorienting for someone accustomed to emotional bargaining. When you argue passionately, they can counter. When you cry, they can dismiss. When you over-explain, they can dissect your words and shift the narrative. But calm assertiveness leaves little to grab onto. It is direct, contained, and grounded in self-trust. What makes it powerful is the absence of emotional chaos. You are not trying to win. You are not trying to convince. You are simply stating a boundary and standing in it. That composure suggests internal stability, and stability is something they cannot easily manipulate. There is also a subtle psychological message embedded in calm assertiveness. I do not need your agreement to honor my limit. That independence disrupts the hierarchy they rely on. They prefer interactions where they dominate emotionally, where you are reactive and they are composed, or where you are defensive and they are dismissive. When you remain composed and self-assured, the imbalance narrows. They may test it. They may mock your tone or accuse you of being cold. But if your delivery stays steady and your actions align with your words, they begin to recognize that intimidation no longer produces submission. Respect in this context does not arise from admiration. It arises from recalibration. They adjust because your emotional center is no longer available for negotiation. Predictability and consistency weaken their intimidation tactics because narcissistic dynamics thrive on volatility. When your reactions are inconsistent, sometimes confronting, sometimes apologizing, sometimes withdrawing, sometimes exploding, it gives them room to experiment. They test different behaviors to see which one gets the strongest reaction. Intimidation works best when the other person is emotionally off balance. If they raise their voice and you panic, they learn that volume equals control. If they give you the silent treatment and you chase, they learn that withdrawal equals power. If they criticize you and you over-explain, they learn that blame equals dominance. But when your responses become predictable in a calm, steady way, the pattern breaks. Predictability here does not mean being passive. It means your boundaries and consequences are reliable. Every time disrespect appears, the conversation ends. Every time manipulation shows up, you disengage. Every time a line is crossed, distance follows. No dramatic speeches, no emotional spirals, just the same measured response. Consistency removes the gamble. Intimidation relies on uncertainty. They count on you second-guessing yourself. They count on you wondering if you overreacted. They count on catching you in a vulnerable mood. When your behavior is steady regardless of their tone, their leverage shrinks. They cannot escalate strategically because escalation no longer produces variation in your response. There is also a deeper psychological shift. Consistency communicates self-governance. It shows that your behavior is guided by internal standards, not by their moment-to-moment pressure. This is unsettling for someone who prefers relational chaos, because chaos creates entry points. At first, they may intensify tactics to test whether your consistency is temporary. But when the outcome remains the same, calm boundary, immediate consequence, emotional neutrality, intimidation begins to lose efficiency. Over time, they recognize that attempts to destabilize you waste energy. And when intimidation no longer shifts your behavior, its value in the dynamic decreases. Self-possession exposes their insecurity because it reflects something they struggle to generate internally: stable self-worth. A narcissistic personality often constructs confidence externally. It is built on validation, admiration, control, comparison. Their sense of superiority requires witnesses. It requires reaction. It requires someone else playing a role in the script. Self-possession, however, is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not seek applause. It does not over-explain. It simply exists. When you are self-possessed, your tone is measured. Your posture is steady. Your decisions are not rushed by pressure. You do not scramble to defend your character when attacked. You do not over-celebrate when praised. Your emotional state appears internally anchored. That kind of stability creates contrast, and contrast is uncomfortable. Because when someone operates from external validation, encountering a person who does not require that validation highlights the fragility beneath the surface. If they boast and you respond with polite neutrality, their grandiosity lands flat. If they attempt to belittle you and you remain unfazed, their attempt at superiority fails to register. The performance has no audience reaction to feed on. Self-possession also removes urgency. You are not in a hurry to resolve every misunderstanding. You are not desperate to be liked. You are not easily hooked into proving your intelligence, loyalty, or worth. That lack of urgency signals independence. Independence signals reduced control. What unsettles them most is that self-possession cannot be easily destabilized. Insults lose traction. Silent treatments lose impact. Love bombing loses intensity. When you are deeply comfortable with yourself, external manipulation struggles to penetrate. This does not mean you never feel hurt. It means your hurt does not dictate your behavior. You process internally instead of performing externally. And when someone realizes they cannot easily provoke, shame, or inflate you, their usual dominant strategies weaken. In the presence of genuine self-possession, insecurity becomes more visible. Not because you expose it, but because it has nothing solid to push against. Walking away without drama is their deepest fear because it represents total loss of influence. Drama, even painful drama, keeps the connection alive. Arguments keep energy circulating, tears keep emotional cords attached, long goodbye messages, repeated closure talks, emotional confrontations. All of it reassures them that they still matter deeply enough to disrupt your inner world. But when you walk away quietly, something entirely different happens. There is no explosion to respond to, no final debate to win, no emotional scene to reinterpret later, just absence. For a narcissistic personality, absence without chaos feels like erasure. If you leave while angry, they can tell themselves you are unstable. If you leave while begging, they can tell themselves you are weak. But if you leave calmly, after stating your boundary and following through, there is very little narrative control available to them. Walking away without drama communicates completion. It says, I have assessed this situation and I am choosing differently. It is not reactive, it is decisive. And decisiveness without emotional volatility removes their ability to position themselves as the more rational or composed one. There is also a deeper psychological layer. Narcissistic dynamics rely heavily on unfinished emotional loops. They expect you to miss them loudly. They expect you to return with questions, accusations, longing, or anger. When none of that happens, they are left alone with uncertainty. They cannot measure your emotional state. They cannot gauge whether you are still attached. That ambiguity is destabilizing. They may attempt hoovering, sudden kindness, crisis claims, nostalgia, or subtle provocations to reopen the loop, not always because they want reconciliation, but because they want confirmation that access still exists. If you respond minimally or not at all, the silence becomes confirmation of something they fear most: loss of relevance. Walking away without drama does not guarantee they transform. It does something more powerful. It removes you from the cycle entirely. And when there is no audience, no reaction, and no return, control dissolves in a way confrontation never could.